Every night at 11:43, a man was standing in my backyard. The first time I saw him, I thought someone had wandered into the wrong property. But the next night, he was there again, standing in the exact same place. The first time I saw him, I was in bed with the lamp still on, answering emails I should have finished before dinner. I looked up because something outside the window felt wrong. The yard light was off, the fence was black against the trees, and there he was, standing in the grass near the back fence, facing the house. He was too far away for me to see his face clearly. He was not looking around. He was not pacing. He was not holding a phone. He was simply standing there with his arms at his sides, facing the window as if he had been there for a while. I waited for him to move. He didn't. I checked the time on my phone. 11:43. I got up, walked to the kitchen, and looked out the back door. He was still there, in the same place. The light over the sink gave me a different angle, but it didn't help. The hood of his jacket hid most of his face, and the yard light behind him turned him into a dark outline against the fence. I reached for my phone to call the police. By the time I looked back, the yard was empty. There was no sound of the gate, no footsteps on the wet grass. He was just gone. The next night, I watched the yard from the kitchen a few minutes before the time. At 11:43, the yard was empty. Then the light above the back door flickered for a fraction of a second. When the light came back, he was standing there again. Same place, same posture. I never saw him approaching my house. One moment the yard was empty. The next, he was already there. I raised my phone and took a picture through the glass. The flash lit up my own reflection in the door, but outside he did not react. I took another photo with the flash off and zoomed in as far as the phone would allow. My hands were shaking enough that I had to steady the phone against the frame. That was when he moved for the first time. He lifted one arm slowly and pointed at the back door. I stepped away from the glass. When I looked again, the yard was empty. The next day I bought a small motion camera from a hardware store and mounted it above the back door. That night, I sat in the kitchen watching the live feed on my phone. The camera showed the patio, the grass, the fence, and the dark line of trees behind it. At 11:43, the live feed froze for less than a second. When the image returned, he was standing in the yard, exactly where he had been the night before. 10 seconds passed. Then he took one step forward, one step closer to the house, and stopped. The yard suddenly felt smaller than it had ever been before. I locked the back door, then checked every other door and window in the house. When I returned to the kitchen, the yard was empty again. The recording saved automatically. I watched it twice. Each time the same thing happened. The image stuttered. When it cleared, he was already standing there. Then he took a single step forward. Then the image glitched again, and the yard was empty. I called the police after midnight and showed them the video. An officer walked the yard with a flashlight and checked the fence and the trees behind the property. He found nothing. The next time the man appeared, he was no longer by the fence. At 11:43, he was halfway across the yard, standing right where the grass reached the edge of the patio light. He was wearing a dark hoodie and dark trousers. His hands hung loosely at his sides, his head slightly lowered, still facing the house. I called the police again and stayed in the hallway while I watched him. He did not move for several seconds. Then he turned his head slowly toward the narrow passage beside the house that leads to the front yard. He began to walk that way. He moved without hurry, passing the kitchen window before disappearing along the side of the house. The officers arrived minutes later. They searched the street, the passage beside the house, and the neighboring gardens. They found nothing. The following night, I did not stay in the house. I booked a motel 20 minutes away and watched the camera feed from there. At 11:43, he was standing on my back patio. Not in the yard, not by the fence. Directly outside the back door. Rain had soaked the hood of his jacket and darkened his shoulders. He stood close enough that the camera should have shown his face clearly, but his face was still dark. The hood covered it, and the shadow from the light behind him hid the rest. I watched him for almost a full minute. Then he lifted one hand and placed it against the back door. The video stuttered. When the image returned, the patio was empty. Seconds later, the camera sent another alert. I opened the live feed again. The backyard was empty, but the back door was open. I called the police. Then I drove home. The police arrived first. The back door was standing open a few inches. Nothing looked forced. Nothing appeared missing. They searched the house. For a while, nothing happened. Then the floorboard above the living room creaked. A single step. Everyone in the hallway heard it. The loft hatch was directly above us. One of the officers pushed it open with his torch. The loft was empty, but on the dusty boards were wet footprints leading from the hatch to the far wall. They ended there, at the plaster, as if someone had walked straight up to the wall and kept going. I stayed outside while the officers finished searching. When they finally left, the house sat dark and silent again. I was standing there in the driveway, trying to decide if it was safe to go back inside. Then the kitchen light came on. The curtain over the sink moved once, and a shape crossed behind it, slow and upright, from one side of the room to the other. My phone vibrated in my hand. The motion camera had triggered again. Movement detected. I opened the live feed. The camera was no longer facing the yard. It was pointing at the kitchen window. He was standing inside my kitchen, waiting.